We've been talking about a video game industry crash for the longest time now. It's been the conversation point for thousands of commentary videos, news articles here and there, and it's just the overall sentiment on social media. Gaming is on a nosedive, and we can see it with the way that the current AAA studios are, where they're bleeding millions of dollars with their latest releases. Live service games are fizzling out and dying just months after launch, and then there's the huge issue that's already started to make its way over to the indie side of gaming too, but we haven't really seen the worst part of it yet. We haven't seen an actual legitimate crash of the video game industry in recent history, but the signs point to the fact that we're getting there. And I mean, sure, last year we had a couple of colossal flops that broke records in amount of dollars flushed down the toilet, like Concord, for example, burning through $200 million just to get beaten out by a common housefly in terms of life expectancy. You had Skull and Bones, rumored to be an $800 million flop, and of course there's the fan favorites like Suicide Squad Killed the Justice League, Star Wars Outlaws, Dragon Age The Veilguard, all of which were supposed to be the frontrunners and the showstoppers of last year that flopped by such a huge margin that, well, it's no surprise that the industry is seeing record layoffs in staff and studios are closing down. But despite all of that negativity, if we talk about actual revenue generated, 2024 wasn't too bad. The total revenue for the gaming industry last year was $184.2 billion, which was an overall 0.2 increase from the previous year. But if we go ahead and take away mobile games, which take up 50% of that number, and just focus on console and PC games specifically, which for all intents and purposes is what we talk about when we talk about the gaming industry dying, well, those numbers actually went down last year by 4% and 0.2% respectively. So not necessarily a huge drop by any means, and if you go back and check how the industry's been performing over the years, well, at surface level, at least you can see that it's been doing just fine. You know, there's no dramatic drop-off like in the 80s, but then if that really is the case and the numbers are doing just fine, then how come everybody keeps talking about how bad things are going? Well, if you mix that in with the current state of what's been happening inside the industry, with studio closures, layoffs, the multi-million-dollar flops, then there's definitely a few warning signs that we might be going down from here. Because you can't simultaneously have an industry that sustains itself year to year with how much money is coming in, while also having one of the biggest studio crises in recent times. So like I mentioned, we haven't seen a real video game crash yet, but I would definitely say that we're past the better years of gaming and we're headed straight into recession. So the question on everybody's mind is, when will the next video game crash be? And more importantly, what's it gonna look like? Well, I think that if we want to understand that, we have to look at the last time that the industry crashed to get a general idea of how things can go wrong. So, for example, the last time that the industry went to the dumpster was back in the 80s during the Atari shock. So in the 80s is when home video game consoles started blowing up and everybody wanted to get their hands on the latest Atari or the Odyssey just to be able to play video games inside of their house instead of having to go to the arcade. This was a billion-dollar industry that peaked in 1983, generating $3.2 billion in the US, like I mentioned, that then proceeded to immediately drop about like 97% all the way down to $100 million in revenue by 1985. So what basically happened is that because the industry was booming, you know, people were going crazy buying just about any video game that was coming out, they just couldn't get enough of this new product that was in the market. And while the early developers of back then, they just started expanding, you know, ramping up production so that way they could keep up with demands. But the problem was that the manufacturers actually overprojected how many people wanted to play games and just made too many video games, you know? They started pumping out a bunch of low quality slop that even for the type of standards that they had back then, you know, which really weren't that many to begin with, even they considered it to be just badly rushed cash grabs. The most famous example here was obviously E.T. the video game, which was a game that was so terrible that they had to bury hundreds of thousands of excess cartridges in a landfill over in New Mexico just to be able to get rid of them. And then there was the Pac-Man port to the Atari 2600, which while it did sell millions of copies itself because of the pre-orders, well, the game was in such a broken state when it came out that it just completely broke the consumer's trust. Back then there was also an important issue with third-party developers which were responsible for most of the slop that was coming out, because usually whenever a famous game released that made an impact on the market, third-party developers would almost immediately start flooding the shelves with knockoff versions of those games. So there was way too much trash to sift through, and well, you know, and just imagine how things were back in the day. You were looking for a brand new game to play, there wasn't any YouTube reviews, no social media to talk about whether the game was good or not, so all you had to go off of to know whether a game was good or not was box arts and commercials, none of which were actually honest with you. So at a certain point, people really just got sick and tired of wasting $40 on these god-awful games that had misleading commercials and a cool-looking box art. So to summarize the crash of 1983, there was a gold rush of home video game consoles and the industry was booming. You know, the market was flooded with a bunch of low-quality slop that nobody wanted to buy, and well, consumers just got tired of the bait and switch and just stopped buying video games altogether. Now, if you compare that to how the current gaming industry is shaping itself to be, and how it's been for the past 10 years or so, let me know if you start noticing any similarities here. Like, for example, we can talk about how the live service industry basically brought a second golden age in gaming, where there was like this brand new cash cow that everybody wanted to get their hands on, and for a moment, all you could see was live service games. Everything that was coming out had some sort of live service element implemented into it just to be able to make more money because it was such a profitable model. And there was also that one report, I don't know if you guys remember, saying that 95% of studios were working on or aiming to release a live service game in the near future. Fortnite really was the blueprint that every other game was following back in 2017. Apex Legends was another major hit when it released, and Call of Duty Warzone, well, you know, it was Call of Duty. A lot of studios back then really thought that this was the future of video gaming, where you had a solid IP with an infinite money glitch that you just had to keep updating and throwing out new microtransactions here and there. And for a while there, it was working just fine. You know, every single free-to-play game that was coming out, it doesn't matter what type of quality it had, was getting tens of thousands of players checking them out. There was a brand new flavor of the week almost every week, you know? Everything was working like a charm, right? It was the brand new gold rush. But then the cracks in the system started showing up, where you suddenly had too many video games out there. You know, there was too many live service experiences, and frankly, just not enough players to be able to sustain all of them. And because studios were rushing to get their games into the market, well, the quality of those brand new live service games was going straight into the dumpster. And I mean, just like a few examples off the top of my head, Anthem was a disaster on launch. Marvel's Avengers was also in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and that was another major flop that ended up getting delisted from the Steam marketplace back in 2023. And well, I already mentioned Concord as another really good example here. You know, the point I'm really trying to make is that there's not enough attention span to keep all of these games afloat, and the players are really experiencing something that's called live service fatigue, where they're just not really engaging with brand new live service games anymore. They're just sticking to their usual couple of games that just keep getting constantly updated because that's where all their progression is. That's where all their skins are. So any new contender that wants to enter the live service market now has to outcompete IPs that have been dominating the space for years at this point, and because of that, now we're seeing more and more live service games that come out that die out almost instantly as soon as they launch, which means more millions of dollars wasted, more studio closures, more layoffs, and just a huge chunk of the industry that's just becoming a wasteland of dead games. So there was an initial gold rush when the industry was booming. Developers overestimated how they could survive in the live service market, and in a rush to monetize their product, they started launching their games earlier and earlier, and that's how we ended up with games that are just dead on arrival. And it's not just the live service side of things that are going through this, because this has been happening all over the AAA industry, and it only makes the case for a video game crash even worse when you factor in how much time and money goes into these huge projects. Like, the standard budget for a AAA game these days is like, what, $200 million or something? It's just ridiculous that we're getting games that are costing more than a Hollywood movie production that just end up being okay, you know, like nothing mind-blowing. Think about games like Starfield, think about games like Cyberpunk 2077 when it first released, and more recently, you know, Dragon Age The Veilguard, Skull and Bones. You know, you have these budgets that keep getting bigger and bigger, and in a day and age where gamers just aren't really buying games like how they used to. There was that one report saying that PC gamers are spending 92% of their time playing older video games in 2025, and they're not even bothering with the latest AAA releases. And you know, to be fair, games these days, they just don't really have the sauce like older games had. You know, something about games that are being released in the new age past 2022 or something just feels creatively bankrupt. It feels sanitized so that way they can try to reach as wide as an audience as possible. And on top of that, they're looking for more ways to try to get as much money out of the players as they can, because they're the ones who decided it was a great idea to sink hundreds of millions of dollars on an unfinished $70 game that just ends up breaking the trust that the players have on the studios that make them. And the funny part is that all of this bloat that you're seeing in the AAA industry, that's all pretty much self-inflicted. You know, they're the ones that keep doubling down and putting more and more money into these projects. They're the ones trying to justify putting battle passes and microtransactions in single-player games. They're the ones who are deciding to do this to themselves. They're the ones who are cracking under the bloat of their own budgets and causing all these massive layoffs. So there's just way too much money going into AAA budgets. There's not enough trust on the studios to deliver a quality game from the players anymore, and there's just not enough people buying the latest releases these days with how huge the catalog of older games already is. And of course, there's always indie gaming, which we haven't really factored into the conversation, and you can usually find an awesome hidden gem for like a fraction of the price of your typical standard AAA game. But the indie scene is also kind of in trouble, because I don't know if you guys have noticed how the consoles marketplace has been looking recently in the indie side of things, like the Nintendo eShop, the PlayStation stores, but the market's already starting to get flooded with a bunch of low-quality shovelware slop. Like, it's no surprise that game development today is just like the easiest and the most accessible it's ever been, which is a good thing, of course, because anybody with a PC easy, can just hop on YouTube and just learn how to use Unity or Unreal Engine or something. But the price that we're having to pay for lowering the bar in game development isn't that you have little Timmy releasing his first indie and having it not be a really good game because he's just learning. It's the fact that now you have office buildings in Moldova, for example, that are releasing multiple asset flips a week, just completely taking over the games to wishlist section on the PlayStation Store, for example. They're not actively trying to make good games, they're just making lazy cash grabs, and it's making it a lot harder for actual small developers to stand out because, think about it from a gamer's perspective. You're looking for something new to play, you go to like the PlayStation Marketplace, and you're not going to be looking for a hidden gem where everything that you see is just AI-generated slop content that barely qualifies as a video game. And from a player's perspective, you can realistically only get ripped off so many times before you just check out entirely from playing indie games. And I don't know if you guys have been keeping up with how AI game development has been looking like over on Twitter X lately, but it's actually super impressive how easy it's been getting to make something that's playable using just a few prompts here and there with tools like Grok and Claude, which can focus on game coding specifically. And we're already starting to see game jams being hosted that are specifically targeted for AI game developers. So in theory, it sounds kind of cool that you with no coding experience can go ahead and make something that's playable in just a matter of hours. But the way I see it is that it's starting to look a lot like how the video game market crashed back in the 80s, where there was just a colossal wave of knockoff games that just completely flooded the shelves, and people just got tired of getting ripped off by scams and lower quality games. So it really just leads to less people being overall interested in searching for and buying indie games at the end of the day. So if we go based off what we've seen so far in the current gaming industry and we compare it to some of the key factors that caused the downfall of the previous crash, I think we can get a pretty good idea of how the next video game crash is going to look like. Live service is going to kill more and more games until you only have a handful of titles like Fortnite, Warzone, and the such, completely dominate that side of the market, and even then people will eventually get tired of that and move on. AAA studios are going to suffer through more layoffs and closures to try to save a ship that's sinking under the weight of their own overinflated budgets, and actual legitimate indie games are going to end up drowning under shovelware cash grab games as AI game development just becomes more and more efficient and more crappy companies try to release more slop into the markets. But the interesting thing is that it doesn't have to be this way though, Like this is what we see happening right now, but studios could one day just wake up suddenly and decide to focus on making smaller core groups to develop more AA titles, for example. And if the recent gaming trend has taught us anything recently, it's that players don't care about how much money you put into your game's development. Like that used to be a flex from back in the day where that developers would use to show off all these hyper-realistic graphics and everything, but people really just want fun out of video games. They just care about having a good time and an enjoyable experience regardless of how much money it costs to make. And for the indie side of things specifically, I always tell people that the best way to stand out as a small creator, whether you be a game developer, a YouTuber, a streamer, whatever, the journey is best documented when you post videos and let people know about who you are, what you're making, and make them feel more attached to the final product, so that way when it's time to launch your video game, you already have a pretty dedicated fan base who's actually excited to try your game. But yeah, that's all I really want to talk about with you guys, so thank you guys for watching.